In a time when women weren't really allowed at sea, her fleet became the scourge of the coasts of Ireland, England, France, and Spain for over 50 years. With her power and influence over the people of Ireland, she caught the attention of Queen Elizabeth I and became a symbol of Irish freedom and rebellion. This is the mythical but true story of Grace O'Malley, Queen of the Pirates. Grace O'Malley was born in 1530 in the county Mayo in Ireland, and she was the daughter of the chieftain of the O'Malley clan, Owen Black Oak O'Malley, and his wife, Margaret. Now, Owen O'Malley was himself an accomplished seaman.
It's Seaman!
Seaman. And the O'Malley clan owned a lot of land in the west of Ireland, and they dominated the seas around Ireland already. So, from a very early age, Grace O'Malley was exposed to life at sea, and she knew that she was destined to be a sailor. However, in the 15th century in Ireland, women weren't really allowed to be sailors. They were expected to be homemakers and wives. So, when she was around 7 years old, her father and mother told her that only boys could become sailors, and that her long hair could end up getting caught in the rigging and get tangled. So, in an act of defiance, she cut off all her hair, dressed up in her brother's clothes, and said, "Alright, I'm ready to sail." And this was her first act of rebellion. Her half-brother teased her for it, calling her Granuaile, which translates to Bald Grace. And this is a name that will become associated with Grace O'Malley in perpetuity. However, seeing how determined his daughter was, her father finally took her to sea on one of his voyages to Spain. Now, Grace O'Malley took to sailing the way a fish takes to water, and she very quickly became an accomplished sailor in her own right, even as a small child. One day, her father's galley came under attack by British pirates, and he warned his daughter, concerned for his safety, to go hide under the decks. But she was always a rebel, and instead of going under the decks, she climbed up into the rigging. And this gave Grace a keen vantage point to observe the battle from, and because of that, she was able to save her father's life. She was able to spot a pirate sneaking up behind her father with his sword drawn. And in defense of her father, she let out a scream, jumped down from the rigging, and landed on the pirate. Now, obviously, a 7-year-old girl flying from the sky yelling at the top of her lungs was really distracting. And it was distracting enough that the Irish pirates were able to kick the British off their ship and win the battle. However, despite her accomplished seamanship, Grace O'Malley was still a woman, and eventually would be called to fulfill her womanly duties to her family. So, in 1546, at age 16, Grace O'Malley entered into an arranged marriage with Donald O'Flaherty, who was in line to become the chieftain of the O'Flaherty clan. Now, the O'Flaherty clan was also powerful landowners, and they had a huge navy in their own right. So, the union of these two Irish tribes gave them a lot of power in the region. And while her new husband, Donald O'Flaherty, was an accomplished seaman, he was rather reckless and hot-headed, and he made a lot of decisions that his crew didn't always see eye to eye with. So it didn't take very long for O'Flaherty's men to recognize Grace's skill as a captain and a diplomat and a trader. And with her natural charisma, she was able to win the hearts of her husband's men, and she kind of started wearing the pants in that relationship. The men respected her more than they respected her husband. And when she wasn't out plundering and voyaging and trading, she was able to give birth to 3 children, her 2 sons, Owen and Murrah, and her daughter, Margaret. So in what was considered a reckless move, Donald O'Flaherty was able to capture Hen's Castle, which was at that time owned by the Joyce clan. Obviously, the Joyces didn't take very kindly to this. So in 1560, Donald O'Flaherty was killed in an ambush, which was probably orchestrated by the Joyces. And when the Joyces learned of O'Donnell's death, they wanted to go take their castle back. And they thought they would meet with little resistance from O'Donnell's little wife, but clearly they didn't know Grace O'Malley. So in order to repel the invaders that were trying to invade her castle, O'Malley took all the lead tiles from the roof and melted them down, and then poured the molten lead off the walls onto the heads of the invaders. Obviously, they all retreated, and Grace successfully defended her keep. So when Donald had captured Hens Castle initially, the Joyces started calling it Cock's Castle in like mockery of Donald's boorish, overconfident attitude. But when Grace successfully repelled them, they humbly went back to calling it Hen's Castle, because the hen rules the roost, I guess. Shortly after this, Grace O'Malley returned to her family home of Belclare on Clare Island. And when her father died, she inherited the title of chieftain of the O'Malley clan and effectively became the notorious Pirate Queen. So when Grace returned to Clare Island, she brought a lot of her late husband's crew and ships with her. The O'Flahertys wouldn't openly support Grace, but a lot of them did discreetly and went with her of their own accord. And with this powerful new fleet, Grace was really able to kick her piracy into high gear and kind of control the trade around the west coast of Ireland. She would capture all kinds of ships, English, Spanish, French, even other Irish ships that belonged to other clan members. She would capture them and charge a tax, or like a protection fee, so she would take what she wanted from their ship and then let them go. So because Ireland at this point didn't really have a central currency, she wasn't looking for gold or treasure or jewels. She was looking for textiles or trade goods, and someone's wealth was measured by how many cattle they had. And Grace allegedly had at one point over 1,000 heads of cattle and horse, so she was considered very wealthy for the time. And it was around this time that Grace allegedly found a shipwrecked sailor and took him on board as her lover. But this affair did not last very long. Her lover was killed when they were attacked by the McMahon clan. Grace's revenge was literally the stuff of legend. She took her entire force and sailed it to the McMahon stronghold of Doona Castle. She was able to capture the stronghold and she executed all of her lover's killers. So fierce was her revenge that she was earned the nickname the Dark Lady of Doona. Grace would eventually get remarried to Richard Burke, the Lord of Rockfleet Castle. And eventually she fell pregnant again with her fourth child. But pregnancy wasn't going to stop Grace from doing what she loved. Tales have it that at one point, her ship came under attack by other pirates. But these pirates soon found themselves distracted by the sound of a woman screaming below deck. Grace was giving birth while her ship was being attacked. As soon as the child was born, Grace picked up her cutlass and ran on deck, screaming and yelling. So the sight of this disheveled woman covered in blood and fighting wildly while a baby is screaming in the background was enough to completely throw the pirates off, and they were able to be defeated, and Grace was victorious again. And that is how her son Tibbet came into the world. Now, Grace and Richard had married under Irish law, which states that after a year, either party can end the marriage. So, as soon as the year was up, Grace took Richard's shoes, she threw them out the door and said, "I release you," and then she took control of Rockfleet Castle. She got the house in the divorce. And not just the house, but also a major portion of his land ownings and his fleet and men. So for the next 20 years, Grace would become a powerhouse in the seas around Ireland, charging her taxes for protection and things like that. She was able to capture over 5 castles with huge tracts of land, and she was able to amass a huge fleet of over 20 ships. The woman had her own navy. However, a new threat was creeping in from the east, and Grace soon caught the attention of a certain English queen. So in 1584, English control was beginning to creep across Ireland, and many Irish chieftains had submitted to English rule, being granted lordships and titles in exchange for their submission to Queen Elizabeth I. So Queen Liz appointed Sir Richard Bingham, an Englishman, as the governor of Connaught, and his job was to kind of bring all the remaining Irish chieftains to heel. And he did not like Grace O'Malley. He described her as a nurse to all rebellions in this province for these 40 years. So he just saw her as a symbol of Irish rebellion and one of the last holdouts for English power in that region. So it was a little surprising when he wrote a letter to Grace offering her a truce. So when she came to his fortress to discuss this truce with him, he captured her and he threw her in prison, killed a bunch of her men, and sentenced her to death as well. But she sat on death row for like 2 years. I think she was too important to just kill right away. However, Grace was eventually rescued and was able to flee back home. In 1586, Bingham wanted to send a message to Grace, and he did so by finding and executing her oldest son, Owen. In response, Grace sent a message of her own to the Queen. She offered to be a privateer for the English in their war against the Spanish, I guess in a way to legitimize her piracy. It was around this time that a bunch of rebellions started springing up in Ireland to oppose British rule, and Richard Bingham still kinda had a grudge against Grace O'Malley. He didn't like her or trust her at all, and he accused her of treason, and when he told the Queen, it kind of fell on deaf ears. So, in order to sort of force Grace's hand, Richard Bingham captured her son Tibbet and her half-brother and accused them of treason. And in response, in a surprise move to everybody, Grace sailed her ship directly to London, which took everyone by surprise because she was able to sneak past all of the English ships in that area. That's how good she was on the sea. So Grace O'Malley sailed directly into London Harbor and demanded an audience with the Queen. And no one knows why, but apparently the Queen agreed. I guess she was intrigued by this powerful warrior pirate woman. So Grace O'Malley strode into the throne room at Greenwich Palace with her head held high. Her and Queen Elizabeth locked eyes for the first time. Grace did not bow. She claimed that she did not recognize Queen Elizabeth as the Queen of Ireland and that she was herself a queen in her own right. Both Grace and the Queen were in their 60s at this time and kind of saw each other as equals. So while they were discussing the release of Grace O'Malley's kin, Grace sneezed, and the Queen offered her a fancy lacy handkerchief. Grace blew her nose and then threw the handkerchief in the fire. All the noble English people were like, "What have you done?" And the Queen chastised her for burning such a lovely gift. But Grace retorted with, "In Ireland we don't keep sullied handkerchiefs, and maybe she was cleaner than the English Queen." There was a moment of silence, and then Queen Liz started laughing. She was amused by this strong, independent woman and demanded the release of her kinsfolk, under the condition that Grace put an end to her life of piracy. And of course, Grace was like, "Yeah, sure, I promise." So Grace took her son and her half-brother and sailed back to Ireland and immediately returned to piracy. So Richard Bingham, as we know, still did not trust Grace, and he continued to harass her and her fleet on the seas, to a point where Grace actually threatened him, "If you keep attacking my ships, I'm going to write a letter to the Queen and tell her that you're harassing me." So Richard Bingham eventually stopped under the condition that he was allowed to leave a small garrison of troops on each one of her ships. And this kind of stymied Grace's attempts of piracy as she used to do it, because she literally had a bunch of English soldiers watching over her shoulder. But she was in her 60s at this time, and her piracy began to slow down slowly and slowly. And eventually she would retire to her new home in Rockfleet Castle. During the 9 Years' War, she was determined to maintain her friendship with Queen Elizabeth, and she encouraged her son and her other troops to actually fight on the side of the British against the rebelling Irish chieftains. And this in turn sort of led to the decline of Irish rule in Ireland. Then in 1595 there was some sort of conspiracy around Richard Bingham, so he fled back to England, where he was consequently thrown in jail, and a new governor of Connaught was appointed. But at this point, Grace was in her late 60s, and she wasn't really pirating anymore. And then in 1603, at the age of 73, Grace O'Malley finally passed away, which is super old for a pirate. Most pirates only have a career of about 2 years, but Grace O'Malley lived a long and influential life and died presumably of old age. And her body was buried in her family home at Clare Island. And so, Grace O'Malley was obviously a very badass woman in a time where women weren't really leaders or sea captains or pirates. And unlike most male pirates, she was able to live a long, successful life and die happy in her home. She has been described as a personification of Irish spirit and rebellion, and there's many statues of her around Ireland. And she's influenced artists all around the world as well. Musicians write songs about her, novelists write books about her. She's even got her own Broadway musical, The Pirate Queen, which I have yet to go see, but it sounds awesome. And she continues to this day to be a powerful symbol of female empowerment and rebellion against patriarchal systems and against authority. And that is the story of Grace O'Malley, Grania Whale, the Pirate Queen. I hope you guys had fun watching this video. If you did, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, ring the notification bell so you know when more of these videos drop. If there's a pirate you want to see me talk about, let me know in the comments down below. And I hope you're all drinking lots of water, doing lots of push-ups, and stay safe. Till next time.